One of the most consistently difficult transitions that I see authors make is moving from writing their book to talking about their book. Anyone who has been through this stage will tell you that this is a total shift in mindset, a total shift in how you're thinking about your book, and a total shift in what is required of you as an author. So today I want to introduce a very simple concept that has made this so much easier for me and my clients: pillars. Stay tuned. You've got the story, you've got the idea, you just don't know the steps in the process. If this is what's holding your memoir back, I have got the solution for you. The Memoir Method Checklist is going to take you through every single step you need from idea to published marketable book. And you can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist. By definition, writing your book is going to require you to be at least a little bit in the weeds, right? You are in the middle of each chapter, each scene, each idea, picking apart all the intricacies and the nuance and the details and the richness of your story or your idea. And yet, no matter how close we are to all those little details, and in fact, the closer we are to all those little details, the more difficult it is to step back and tell our readers why they should read the book. Yes, they're going to love those little details. They're going to love the poetic way you're describing things. They're going to have their minds blown at the depth of your ideas throughout the book. And yet, getting at all those little nitty-gritty pieces is not usually persuasive for a potential reader. So what do we need to do? Instead, we need to figure out a way that we can boil our book down to the juiciest, most helpful pieces, because those are the pieces that are going to convince your reader to pick that book up and actually read all those little details and poetry that you have so painstakingly included. But that is only the beginning, my friends, because yes, we need a cohesive, brief way to explain what our book is. But we also need some fuel that is going to drive our marketing efforts for the long term. We are never just simply putting our book on Amazon with some marketing copy and expecting it to sell. If you want your book to get to the readers who need it, you need a plan to be able to be out in the community, out online, wherever it is that your readers are, talking about the concepts that they need to hear. Now, I find that the most difficult aspect of this is balancing putting your idea into a nutshell, something that people can process very easily, but balancing between that and a slightly richer description of what your book is about, what your book is teaching people, that doesn't go all the way into the weeds. We need to be somewhere in between with some balance between detail and big idea. Now, you have some options, right? You can certainly hire a marketing firm. You can hire a publicist who will read your book and help you come up with what some of these talking points might be. You can ask friends and family to give feedback. All kinds of options. But what I find is that the most valuable way that an author can approach this is to really step back and see themselves as someone who is going to learn from their book. What if you think about yourself not as the teacher, but as the student? And that is exactly what this pillar system is going to allow you to do. So before further ado, this is going to be a pretty quick, tight video because I just want to get into the idea of pillars so that you can go play with what you're trying to do with that. Now, I'm going to use an example from my own book, and this book is not a memoir. So I know many of you watching are memoirists, but all of this applies very neatly to any type of book you're promoting. In fact, any type of platform you're promoting, because all we're doing is boiling down the most important lessons and then making a flexible plan for how we can teach those lessons over and over and over without feeling too repetitive. So, first of all, what do I mean when I say pillar? Well, I find that this is actually pretty intuitive for most people. Think about when a politician is running for office. Now, you can think about presidential race if you want to, or maybe we want to think about like city council. But at every level, when people run for office, what they need to do is explain very clearly and very succinctly what it is they believe in, right? And for this reason, the major political parties in the US have actually detailed positions on a lot of the major issues that they have figured out through polling that people care about, right? So those are static for them. But when you see politicians on talk shows or on the news or at their press conferences, you'll notice that they're going to get into these different ideas that they have in lots of different ways. A pillar is effectively the piece of your platform that stays constant, regardless of how you talk about it. And here's why that's important. We can use our politician example to continue here, because sometimes we will see politicians on comedy news shows, right, or talk shows, the View or Real Time with Bill Maher or The Daily Show, and as they are moving through different contexts, these different contexts are going to require a different approach, right? We don't want to go on The Daily Show and then just be kind of dry and dull. People are watching that show to laugh. So even though politicians may not go on shows and make a bunch of jokes, we still need a lighter tone. Now, on the other hand, when there is an event that is a more serious event, say a commemoration or a dedication, it might not be appropriate to use that same lightness to approach that point. Instead, they're going to need to be able to present it in a way that matches the mood. But notice, no matter how we're shifting context, those platform pieces are going to stay the same. And those platform pieces, those are your pillars. So as we start to think about your pillars, the very first thing that you're going to need to do is figure out 5 talking points, 5 lessons, 5 things that you want to teach to people that you feel like you could either go very far into depth on, you could give a lot of nuance, a lot of detail, a lot of examples, or, and this is key, you could also explain that lesson in a couple of sentences if you needed to. Now, what does this allow us to do? When we pick with those criteria, thinking about what we could talk about for a long time, say in a keynote speech, or a very brief time, say in an interview with a journalist, we are giving ourselves options. We are giving ourselves a way to really brand our ideas and our book and the way we help people in a way that feels authentic, but is still really, really flexible. So the first thing I want you to do is I want you to go through that manuscript draft. You might even go back to your outline, by the way, and I want you to really think about what are the 5 lessons. A word of caution here. Memoirists, your 5 lessons are not stories. I'm going to get into that in a second. Your lessons are going to be your themes. In the memoir method, we teach that you need to have one key message. Your key message is absolutely going to be within your pillars. You can do that in a couple of ways. Either your main message can be one of your 5 pillars, or very often your key message actually can be broken into a couple of pillars, which leaves you then a couple of spaces that you can kind of fill in some sub-themes or some other ideas that come up. The best way to do this is to read through your book as a student, as someone who is learning from you. When you read through it in that way, oftentimes you'll start to see that, oh, okay, I am kind of repeating, I am kind of getting at the same idea in all these different ways. Write that down. That is a pillar. And once you have gone through your whole book and brainstormed a list, narrow that down. What are the 5 things that you could talk about in depth or in a couple of sentences? Now, here is where the magic of pillars happens, because yes, it is very helpful just to have those ideas on their own, but we can go much, much further with this. So the way I recommend you approach this is to draw out a grid. Now, if you want to do this in the computer, you can do that. You can put a table into a Google Doc or a Word doc. I like to just do it by hand. And what you are doing is making a 5 by 5 grid, a table. Along the left-hand side of your grid, you are going to put one of your pillars for each of your lines of your table. Just write it right there out to the side. The magic of pillars is that if you have chosen well, if you have chosen messages or themes or lessons that you can talk about in lots of different ways, lots of detail, or very, very briefly. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to use my own book as an example here because this has really served my co-author and I very well to have these really stable ideas that we talk about over and over and over in different contexts. But no matter your book, you will have these. And I promise you, if you read that draft, maybe even a couple times, you will be able to jot these down off the top of your head. They should feel really intuitive. So, the book that I'm going to talk about is The Summer of 2020, George Floyd and the Resurgence of the Black Lives Matter Movement. That is my book that I co-authored with Dr. Andre E. Johnson, and it came out in 2024, earlier in the year. So, what are the 5 pillars that we talked about over and over and over? The 5 pillars that helped us put that book into a nutshell while still allowing us to elaborate. Number 1, and the most frequent one we talked about, is that movements are about people, not just leaders. It's a big one. Oftentimes when we think of civil rights movement, we are just seeing people like Martin Luther King. We are not seeing all of the people who sacrificed huge things, sometimes their lives, to build this movement. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar, other social influences that may not have seemed to be related to the Black Lives Matter movement actually were hugely influential. Some of the specific things we talked about here were COVID. Obviously, these protests are happening during COVID, so we wanted to think about how were people thinking about safety at a time that we didn't even know if it was safe to be outside around other people. And what we found was they were thinking about it, and they had to weigh their dedication to the cause with this idea of being physically safe. The third pillar that we talked about was that as we moved through 2020, as these reading materials were being circulated, what we found was that people were very good actually at incorporating some of these concepts into the Black Lives Matter movement. Specifically, we looked at things like intersectionality, where people were thinking about gender, class, disability, as things that should be part of what Black Lives Matter was active in. That's a pretty new phenomenon, so we really wanted to talk about that and make sure that was clear. The fourth pillar, having cameras in our pockets has already changed the world. Some of the consequences that happened after George Floyd's murder were unprecedented. And part of that is because we not only have the ability to record things in a flash without having to have a Sony Handycam the way that George Holliday did, but also because we can share it so quickly. We can get it on the internet for everyone to see. We don't have to worry about physical media. It's digital. It's very easy to do, and we have already seen that changing the course of our history. And the final pillar that we talked about over and over is that the Black Lives Matter movement of 2020 made huge headway in terms of inclusivity. There were lots of changes that happened, particularly with marches and thinking about how people, for example, in wheelchairs or who need walkers, were able to participate in the march. But we did not make as much progress in terms of longevity. So a lot of the movement kind of fizzled out pretty quickly after it had started when we think about the span of human history. Okay, agree or disagree with those pillars? That is what we came up with in our book. Our book is 300 pages long. It's a long book, but when we can boil it down to the things that are going to be easy for us to talk about, we give ourselves so much flexibility. So as I was working on these pillars for our book, how we wanted to talk about this, I draw a grid. Now, all your grid is just a table. You can do this in Word, you can do this by hand, but you are just doing 5 squares by 5 squares. Now, along the left-hand side, left of your grid, all you're going to do is jot down those pillars. So I had my 5 pillars. I'm going to write them down along the left-hand side of the grid, 1 per row. And here is where the magic happens. As I said earlier, we don't just want to be able to give the facts, right? Those kind of quick rundowns that I gave you of what we talked about. I hope it's interesting, But really, if you want a dynamic interview, a dynamic presentation, a dynamic keynote speech, you need a lot more than that. People do not want to just hear us rambling on about our ideas. We need a way to connect to them. And that's what's going to go along the top of your grid. You have your 5 rows. Now let's do our 5 columns. Now, what you're doing here is you are looking for ways that you can extend that conversation, tailor it to the space you're in, and make it clear and relatable for your audience. So what are some examples of what you could put along the top here? I always want to have a story column. Always have a story column. Memoirists, you may have more than one story column actually, because you are largely teaching in your book through story. But no matter your nonfiction book, you always want to have a story column. So put that there. The second thing you might have is an anecdote. Now, stories and anecdotes, very, very similar, but usually I will think about the difference between these in that a story is going to have much more depth. You have much more kind of background. Whereas an anecdote is often something that we can kind of tell quickly, usually has a little less personal connection to us. Sometimes it's something we've heard from somebody else. So we can have an anecdote there. The third thing we might put along the top is we might want to put some research. So particularly if your book is dealing with something that is an expert level issue, a research column is really going to help you. You can think about how you might incorporate things like statistics, facts about the world that people might not know, history, things that you've kind of dug up as you've been doing your research, but this is going to be something that the everyday average person probably doesn't know. We're going to elevate a little bit through research. You might decide to include an analogy or a metaphor, a way for people to think about the idea that you're advancing that is a little closer to home. I did that earlier in this video, by the way, when I used the politician example. I knew that this pillars idea might not be familiar, but I also knew that political platforms are usually relatable to the people who listen to this podcast or watch the YouTube videos. And then finally, your 5th item along the top of your pillars grid might be an exercise or a question to your audience. So in this case, you would either be having them actively do something, and this can be great if you're, for example, on a podcast interview or a YouTube interview, or you may decide that you want to just ask them a question to kind of think about, to kind of take with them home after the keynote or whatever it might be. So now you may have guessed what we're doing. We have along the left side of our grid our list of pillars, and along the top we have a list of the ways we might explain those pillars. Now, all you need to do is fill in the grid. So for instance, if I was going along the pillar grid for the summer of 2020, I might start with our first pillar, which is movements are about people, not just leaders. And then I might have that intersect with my story column. And what I would put in here is a story about one of our participants that we spoke to, one of the people that had protested with those 2020 protests. And what he had explained to us was that he always thought you needed to kind of have some kind of expertise, you needed to kind of be somebody important to be part of a movement. This is such a good illustrator of this point, right? Because if we're thinking about how do we learn about civil rights, almost always it's going to be Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, right? We don't hear about the ordinary people. And what this fellow shared with us, there's more to the story, by the way, but abbreviated version. What this fellow shared with us really illustrates how important it is to be talking about the fact that movements are more than just the leaders. We can go through that with our anecdote, we can go through with our research, etc. When you are done with your pillar grid, then you are going to end up with 25 high quality points that you can make in any interview that you can use to piece together a keynote address or a panel talk, or you can just use them to have in your back pocket as you are out and about talking about your book. And the value of this is that it, number one, keeps you on brand. It keeps you from straying into other things you think are interesting. 2, it helps you remember that your book is actually interesting. It is so easy to forget that what you are writing about in that book is something that really, really matters to people. And when you have all of this variety of ways to talk about it, you are doing yourself such a favor in that area. And 3, you are ready. I could give an interview on this book without any preparation at all because I have a really clear sense of what those 25 talking points I can hit. I don't even need the questions in advance because I know I can pivot any question into one of those 25 pieces of information. Magic. Okay, so as you are transitioning out of that drafting stage or even the outlining stage and into a real targeted marketing campaign, I really want you to sit with these pillars. I really want you to think about, how can I talk about this book in a way that is true to the book, in a way that teaches my readers the valuable lessons I wanted to get across, and in a way that's interesting, that I can feel really good about my appearances. Okay, as you're working on that, I would love to hear how this works from you. Are there other things that you need to really make this effective? Let me know. I would love to talk about whatever would be useful for you. You can email in if you're part of our newsletter, leave a comment on the podcast or the YouTube videos. I can't wait to hear from you. Otherwise, happy marketing and happy writing. You know what they say, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And this is exactly what holds so many people back on their memoir projects. That is exactly why we created the Memoir Method Checklist, a full, complete list of every single step you need to take to get that memoir written, published, and marketed successfully. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/checklist.